is what early notation actually looked like. When we look at it now, it's very difficult to imagine what it actually sounded like. Back at this time, everything was passed on orally, which means that the teacher would teach the student how to sing these various chants. Then that student would teach his student, and it wasn't written down for quite a number of years. When they started writing it down, it was really to help remember what the sounds were like, but it was still strongly oral in its tradition. As notation became better, the oral tradition became less important and the written tradition became more important. Because these squiggles were so difficult to interpret, and because these squiggles were also just used as a memory aid for the oral tradition, notation became more and more important, and it became more and more precise. We're going to look at some of these slides just so you can see how notation has changed over the years. These squiggles above the words would help the performer know whether or not the pitch would go higher or lower. This was still primarily an oral tradition which was passed down. However, these little markings would help the performer know and remember how the piece would go, with a little bit of memory help from those squiggles. I think this is a really, really pretty slide with the pink, with the red, really not pink, but the red color and brown. I think it looks really, really pretty. But you can see in this, again, you have those funny squiggles above the text. So again, it's primarily oral with some memory help with those funny little squiggles. However, it would be very hard to tell if your pitch would be higher or if it would be lower, and also which notes go with which syllables. Here's the much more advanced way where you can see we have our 4 lines, which is the beginning of the staff as we know it today. You see there's even lines that you could take as bar lines almost. You see those? It also, at the end of the lines, it just looks like it's a check mark. Well, it's not a check mark. It's a way of writing different types of notes. Notice how some of the little square notes are close together, some are further apart, some are connected, some are one on top of another. They're written in all different ways. Once the notation was to this point, it was getting much easier for people to know what the music should sound like, and the oral tradition wasn't quite as important as it was on some of our earlier slides. Over time, it became more and more important for us to have more lines to more accurately be able to say what the pitch was. And that's where we came up with the grand staff. When you look at the grand staff, it was also called, or can be called, the great staff. There are a lot of lines here. As a matter of fact, there are 11 lines. This is a huge improvement from our 4 lines. However, when you first look at this, it can be a bit of a challenge to read because that's a lot of lines to take in. Eventually what happened is the middle line was taken out. The middle line is where middle C is. The middle C line was taken out. It made our staff much easier to read because we have 5 lines, a space, and 5 lines. And of course the top 5 lines became the treble clef and the bottom 5 lines became the bass clef, and middle C we just add a line whenever we need it.